Good afternoon, all the friends of the Nordic business ethics. I am so happy to sit in this familiar sofa of my speaker and kick off the third season of the EthicsTalk Live. So this is the third year we are doing this together with my speakers and DLA Pipers. And me and Anna, we are so happy to have these amazing partners doing this with us. And of course, all of the exceptional guests that we are going to have also during this year. So during this year, we're going to have, just like in the previous years, many insightful and inspirational conversations with expert guests on various topics in the area of business ethics. And today, we'll kick off this season with the topic that is, I think, is very personally important for many of us. So we're going to talk about sports and ethics. And I think if we think about the past 1 year or so, we have been constantly reminded about the dark side of the sports, and there are many ethical dilemmas that we can look from various angles. There was the football World Cup in Qatar, and we know that there are these human rights violations and corruptions behind. But then on the other hand, we have the ultimate aim of sports with the peace. And of course, the war in Ukraine has also brought a lot of ethical questions that we're going to talk about today with our guests. And all of you who are watching us live, we are hoping that you're going to join the conversation. So feel free to ask your questions and your ideas on the chat. And today we have also specially made for you a couple of polls, so you'll be able to also give your 10 cents for the conversations. So you can see that I'm actually sitting here all by myself without Anna. So Anna is with us here, but she is joining us today online in just a couple of seconds. But I have the great honor of having a very special guest here in the studio with us. So actually, as my speaker is our key partner in the EthicsTalk Live, so we are having the key person behind the scenes also for my speaker. So Andre Noel Schacker, welcome to EthicsTalk Live.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for having
so
me.
Happy to have you here. So why Andre is sitting here with us? So there are many reasons, and there is a long CV that I would probably get very much wrong if I would start reading this out loud. But maybe what we can say about Andre is that you're a writer and a speaker and a lawyer, and you have an extensive history within the sports in various international organizations. And maybe most recently, what to mention is your role as the independent chairman of the World's Anti-Doping Agency's signatory expert group. Did I get it right?
That's right. That's right. So it's a long title. Yeah. Sorry.
Exactly. And also, you have written a few books on international sports law and governance. So really looking forward having this conversation with you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. And while we are getting cozy here at the sofa in the studio, so I'll let Anna to continue and introduce our guest online.
Nyt ei kuule.
Anna, are you on mute?
No, I'm not.
Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me now? No,
Yes.
I wasn't muted, so it wasn't mine. But yeah, so hello also from my side. And I have to say that I am very excited about this discussion. I'll come back to why in just a minute. But I'm tremendously honored to introduce to you Nick. So Nick Fitzpatrick, he's a partner at DLA Piper. DLA Piper is a partner in this, so enabling the EthicsTalk Live discussions. We are super thankful for that. And Nick has worked, you worked globally with various organizations, advising on many angles of sports related issues and also touching upon the ethical dilemmas and so on. And I think we you have represented many organizations and maybe represent some organizations as we speak as well. So we will obviously tread carefully, and we've said that in our EthicsTalk live discussions, it's fine to say that we can't respond or we don't have the answers or so on. It's all about the honest discussions. So super excited, Nick, that you could join us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And then also with us from early morning New York, Alison, so happy to finally have you in one of our EthicsTalk live discussions.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much.
So, and those of you who are active on LinkedIn, you cannot have missed Alison Taylor, who's a superstar on LinkedIn and just provoking all of us, I think, with your insightful comments on environmental, social governance issues and corporate responsibility. And you are really a voice for this transition that we see, the new expectations that we have on corporates. And also, I think you're fairly open, Alison, with that there are real dilemmas. We should not simplify issues. Yes. And you've also had pretty frank opinions about the sport, sort of how corporates should relate to this. So yeah, very, very happy to have you here with us today, Alison.
I'm very, very happy to be here, Anna.
And I have to say a special thank you for taking time in the midst of, we know you're writing a book. We are all...
No, it's my draft is in. I am waiting to hear from the editor, so the timing is perfect.
Oh, that is awesome. So everybody on the line, watch out for Alison's book. It's going to be a blockbuster. I'm super excited to be able to dive into it myself. So I think that will provide a lot of inspiration, insights, and thought-provoking ideas to all of us. But so shortly, why am I then so excited about this topic? I think we have actually with Andre and Nina, we have discussed already for maybe over a year and a half, 2 years, that we want to have a discussion on ethics, sports, but we did not really find an angle. We were like, this is huge, it's massive. I mean, how do we bring that into a 45-minute discussion? At the same time, we felt that there is something there that we have to discuss, because as Nina was saying, the ultimate aim of sports, it's something good. We know it's good for the youth. We know it brings people together. It brings peace. On the sports field, everybody should be equal. There shouldn't be conflicts. Your background shouldn't matter. It is all about the game and the performance in the game. But at the same time, we read, well, it's discrimination, it's harassment, it's corruption, it's fraud, it's human rights abuses. And for me, it's like, okay, how do we reconcile these two? Should we just ignore it? Or can we have an honest discussion and also bring in the corporate perspective? Because we know many of us who work in corporates, our organizations are sponsoring various type of events. We're bringing our customers, clients to sports events, and we just sort of view it as a good thing, as a neutral thing. But should we, think a little bit more about what our stance is on these issues as companies? So at the outset, what I want to say and what we want to sort of put as a disclaimer with Nina, this is going to be a difficult discussion, but we have to have it. So proud and happy to be able to have it with all of you. And with that, Nina, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Anna. And I think that was a good introduction for the first question. So I think if we try to come up with some concrete example of these ethical dilemmas we have, so I think many individuals and organizations had struggles thinking what is the right thing to do in relation to the football World Cup in Qatar. So we know that there is behind these huge human rights violations, there is corruption, not to mention the environmental impacts of building the whole scene. So this topic was lots in media and lots in the table discussions of many just a few months back. So I'd like to ask from all of our guests that can you come up, because this is not a black and white solution, so can you come up with one argument for and against that, why was it a good or bad thing to have the World Cup in Qatar? Andre?
Well, from the outset, I was one of the few people who actually have seen these kinds of processes from very close to, from being a lobbyist of sorts for our national bid to host the Winter Games in Helsinki back in the 90s. And we had a very sustainable idea, is that Finland didn't have mountains, so we would share. We would share, and therefore, it would be a lot easier financially and also ecologically. We would combine Lillehammer with Helsinki and Lahti, and that would be a sustainable choice. And it seems that at that time, and also later, within FIFA, the sustainability arguments are not very strong arguments, and that is definitely one thing that should have been a red flag already. Not to mention Qatar's record on treating people badly at the workplace, on working sites, on construction sites. These things were known and should have been part of, and I'm sure they were to a certain extent part of the documents produced for the FIFA decision process, but they were, of course, ignored, and through corruption, as we know. And so that definitely a lot of reasons not to give it to them. But of course, the idea of rotating these events. The idea of Pierre de Coubertin that once in a person's lifetime, the Olympics or a big event should be close to home, so that children can be inspired and go physically and see these games at least once in their lifetime. So that there's an idea, a beautiful idea there, that it's never been in the Arab world. The Arab world is 1 billion people. They've never had anything like this. And therefore they should have it once. So the argument went that way, and it's a beautiful argument to make. But in the balance of the ethical concerns, I think they should never have had it.
Thanks, Andre.
So, Alison, what's your take then on this sort of for and against for the World Cup in Qatar?
I'm really struggling to think of arguments for it, to be perfectly honest. I think, not a great location in terms of size and heat and existing capacity. We all are familiar with the problems with the process. But also, I think the human rights abuses that everybody has spoken to in the Gulf in general, and not least in Qatar, probably should have been prohibitive. I know my brother, who is an enormous lifelong football fan, did not watch any of the games, and I believe it was excellent football because of the human rights concerns. So if I were going to say there would be one good thing, I mean, certainly the discourse has changed to focus on this. Certainly it highlighted these problems. Certainly it brought some of the corporate dilemmas into the mainstream discussion. So I was particularly encouraged. I think there was somewhat less in the US, but I was in the UK at the time. There was a lot of press coverage, a lot of mainstream coverage on the BBC News, for example, every night about the human rights concerns. So I tend to think that higher awareness and more clarity on the relationship between corruption and human rights abuses is a very good thing. And this is a very good case study in that regard. So I guess I will say the positive thing is more awareness and a better discussion of these issues.
Yeah, well, always something positive, right? So Nick, we already, Alison touched upon the UK. So what's your perspective here? I think you are muted.
Well, there was a great UK ban that the Clash, who once encapsulated the issue, should you stay or should you go? And I suppose the fundamental argument here, which is always used, is do you exercise your influence when you're conducting major events by embracing dialogue and getting involved in territories that have development needs in one particular aspect or another? Or do you shun them or boycott them effectively? There are arguments on both sides, some of them legitimate, some of them, frankly, self-serving. On the positives, I'd say that the kafala system of employment, which is common across the Middle East, it's not purely a Qatari problem, so it impacts a whole bunch of territories there, is one that, having won the games, the Qataris engaged in at least 2 major international investigations into how to make improvements into the kafala system, both of which demonstrated improvements or progress in terms of how that system was being operated within the territory. One of those was led by Senator George Mitchell, and would those have happened without the World Cup being there? Probably not. So, I think that's one issue that we need to take into account, along with all the good points that have already been made. I think that would Qatar now be in a position, having created a whole mini city of temporary accommodation for that event, be in a position to donate that now to the earthquake relief effort that's going off in Syria? Clearly, it would not. So, there are, that doesn't seek to excuse or justify any of the issues which clearly apply in that region. But there are two arguments, two sides to the argument, I suppose. I think the other thing here that interests me is that there is a somewhat double standard we occupy here, and we should remember that one of the reasons why major events are going to regions of the world where there are, very significant cultural differences in opinion on issues of, discrimination or human rights, is because they are yielding massive benefits to the international sports bodies who are putting the events in there. And I'm not singling out FIFA or IOC or Formula One or any one of these things, but there is a reason why other parts of the world are now being considered more typically to host these events. And one of those reasons is that it's more difficult for what you might call traditional Western, particularly European countries, to generate the sort of revenues and the sort of governmental guarantees and the legislative changes, the protections around game-specific IPR and tax and all the rest of it that traditionally would have been a no-brainer for many of those governments. So I think there is a danger. There is a danger that we stray into hypocrisy on these things. We need to remember that this is not simply an issue which is is the local territories issue, but also an issue for our own sports regulators and governing bodies. Then they are net beneficiaries of this situation. So it's a difficult. I mean, you've got to take it on a case by case basis. There are no easy answers here.
No, exactly. And that's why we have the discussion. And I think it's so. But what if we take it then from sort of the macro level to the micro level? Because now we've been talking about states, countries, big organizations, but at the end of the day, it's individuals that are athletes and that are competing. And there is this UN resolution that was recently adopted around sport as an enabler for sustainable development. I think it was in December last year, so it's a really new thing. And there it is stated that sports events should be organized in the spirit of peace, mutual understanding, friendship, tolerance, without discrimination, and all of that. And if we take it down to individual level, we now also have a discussion around not only countries, but then athletes. So, for example, athletes from Russia and Belarus, whether they are allowed to compete. So then we are really going from country level perspective to individual level. And before we open up this dilemma for the panel, Nina, should we ask our audience, should we have our first poll to see what our audience think about whether individual athletes should be penalized due to the country which they represent?
Yes, let's open the poll, and while our audience online are trying to find their answers, so I'll give the floor to Andre. Andre, what are your take on this?
It's unfair that I always have to start questions, but yeah, this is a very difficult issue. It's a very difficult issue for the Olympic movement as a whole, for sports as a whole. What we're seeing at the Olympic level, and I've been working with the International Olympic Committee now for almost 30 years in different capacities, and it's an embedded concept that goes all the way back to antiquity in Greece, that when the Olympics are on, politics are off. We take a break from fighting. We take a break from the warring factions between the cities of Greece, and then we try to have a peaceful moment, and we try to go above politics, above conflict, to create a more peaceful world. So we're seeing this heritage in the thinking of the International Committee, that has, of course, banned the National Olympic Committees of Belarus and Russia, which is the right thing to do, obviously. However, they are keeping the door open for athletes who have a passport from Russia and Belarus. And the idea, and as is the case in many UN resolution and in international law, you should not be discriminated on the basis of your nationality or discriminated on the basis of what passport you have. And it's a very good argument to make. And given that we had a similar situation with Russia. I know I was serving on the IWF legal commission, and we've been having problems with anti-doping with Russia for the past 20 years, and it led to the entire team being banned from the last Winter Games in Korea, and Russian athletes were allowed to participate as part of an independent team called the Olympic athletes from Russia. So what's brewing within the Olympic movement is an idea where if certain criteria, ethical and legal criteria, could be developed, of course the anti-doping rules would apply 100%, and that's clear. But now there would be something like, and this is not finalized, something like, if a holder of a Russian or Belarus passport would sign a declaration that they condemn this war, and they commit to that, they should be allowed as human beings, as elite athletes that deserve to be there because of their performance level, should be able to participate in the games in Paris. The mayor of Paris is not happy about this. The Ukrainians are not happy about this. The Ukrainian Olympic Committee is threatening to boycott because of this. So it's a big question. And I'm seeing, I'm seeing the results already. So we see we have a division here already of 64. It's not an easy issue. Personally, if I had to vote, I would say no. But the criteria would have to be extremely strict to ensure the ethical integrity of what we're doing, to make sure that the people who would be accepted in a team that would be a neutral team at the Olympics would fit a specific criteria where we know that they are aligned with the ideas of Olympism, anti-doping, and anti-war.
Great answer.
And I think it's super interesting to see that you've been able, Andre, to argue a little bit for this, because we can see that the results have been shifting. I think starting out where the yes were close to 80%, and now we have yes close to 70.
I'm glad you're saying that, Nina, because as you said, there are no simple issues in ethics. I mean, it's not black and white.
Yeah. So I think it's super interesting, Andrea. You've been able to argue a bit for this. I think the yes group started out being bigger and then decreased sort of when you were speaking. But I think the verdict is out from the group here that individual athletes should be penalized due to the country that they represent. Now that's decreasing a bit again, and becoming. But
I'm a lobbyist.
The sort of yes side is still a bit higher. But I think this takes us brilliantly to the corporate world, because in the corporate world, you cannot discriminate individuals based on race or background or passport or so on. So this is interesting. And Alison, I would like to pose a question to you then, what does this mean? Like, first of all, different standards perhaps for the sports world and corporate world. So do you think there should be similar type of standards that you have for companies within the sports sector? What's your take, Alison?
I mean, I don't know that this is different for sports organizations than corporations in general. I think we have had, I suppose what we're having, right, as a society is this reckoning of an idea that we used to have in the 1990s and early 2000s, that we have foreign direct investment into countries with authoritarian governments or that need some development, that the result of these investments and engagement will be that economy opens up and then will become more democratic and the world will advance and we will all end up in a happy future at the end of history. And that, I think, is looking much, much more problematic. We are really coming to a reckoning between what Western consumers and Western societies think of as human rights problems with what the rest of the world thinks. Areas of international consensus driven by the UN, for example, are becoming much, much more problematic. And so I think for many, many companies, and I'm thinking about all the companies operating in China, for example, that are coming under huge pressure on human rights questions, I think we are starting to get into situations where companies in any context are having to think about how they operate and on what grounds. And this is particularly in the context of rising human rights regulatory pressure out of the EU, which seems to be encouraging companies to protect their own operations, to protect their human rights of their own operations, which might lead to divestment. But I think real questions about what that does for the human rights agenda globally as a whole. So there are many actions companies and sporting organizations can take to protect human rights in their own operations that have the effect of worsening human rights globally overall. And I think we really lack consensus on these questions. In many ways, the question of divestment from countries is similar to divestment from oil and gas. Like, we don't know the second order consequences. We don't know what is going to happen if Western businesses do this, what the response will be, what that will do to supply chains, what that will do to geopolitics. So, I mean, we know from psychology, Anna, that it is better to engage. It is better to see the full humanity of people. It is better to have conversations. It is better to try and work through these knotty issues and acknowledge that different cultures and different individuals have very different value systems. But I think we're just at the beginning of this conversation. I think we have very simplistic ideas from the responsible business world about what will happen if certain businesses take certain actions. And I just think we need a bit more of a grown-up, nuanced conversation. It was very interesting to see the black and white thinking on who shouldn't be operating in pulling out of Russia. Businesses like Unilever and Nestle saying, Russians deserve to have pet food and baby food too. And many Western consumers saying, no, you shouldn't be there at all. So we're really in a very polarized, pluralistic situation. And I think one of the reasons I like this topic so much this morning is that it is a way into these much bigger and more fraught questions. So all I've done is raise more concerns in response to your question, but that's where I see we are with this conversation globally.
Yeah, Nick, would you agree that the conversation is just starting, and do you have any practical examples to share from your perspective?
Yeah, I think broadly that is the case. I mean, obviously it's evolving, and we're at the bottom of a big hill on this. I should incidentally say I'm expressing my views and not corporate views on this call, but I mean, it seems to me that going back to the initial question, it is clearly the case, particularly in events like the Olympics, that victory has been a source of soft power for states since the birth of the modern Olympic movement. You think back to the Berlin Olympics and Jesse Owen and all the rest of it. And, so, where folks are participating under a state flag, seems to be there is a fairly clear argument that where that state is engaged in certain categories of activity which are clearly an infringement of international law, then there is a good legal basis to, withhold the ability of athletes to compete under that flag. I think it becomes much more nuanced where individuals are participating without being under a flag. And there I find the arguments against allowing that much more difficult, because to make individuals responsible for the actions of the state is, regarded in some respects, in some contexts, as being racist. And we need to be quite careful about how we do that. The Jesse Owens example is a good one, incidentally, because that's often cited as a reason why you don't avoid territories. I mean, we should consider for a moment what would have happened if that race had gone the other way, and what political messaging would have come out of that event. It's quite a big question to leave on the outcome of a running race. So I think that's my first point. I mean, the second point is I think there are some events that are clearly so heinous, and history has shown us, retreating from countries in those circumstances is effective. And I think waging aggressive war, which Russia might be said to be doing now, is a good example of one of those post the Nuremberg lessons. I think it is clearly the case. I was speaking to somebody who'd been involved in the apartheid struggle in South Africa very closely, that they felt the only reason why the regime started to embrace the need to abandon the apartheid regime was because of the actions of global corporates and global sports organizations in boycotting South Africa. I think so. Systems of apartheid are a good example of that too. I think equally illegal occupations of the kind that Russia is undertaking is a good example of that. So I have no problem with saying that there should be action against states that are intervening. I think it can be a very effective way. I would simply say that we are no longer in a unipolar world. We should be as prepared to accept, if we're accepting these arguments about our geopolitical enemies, if you like, that we accept them about our geopolitical allies. There should be a commonality of how we assess that. And I don't necessarily think there is at the moment. I think we have I'm not going to call it a white savior complex, but we have perhaps a double standard we operate across territories, which we shouldn't forget. I think in a business context, listen, I mean, sport is business on one level. It's more than business, but it is business. And so all the levers that apply in a business environment clearly also do apply in a sporting environment. And it's for individual corporates when they're involved with, events which provoke geopolitical issues or provoke human rights issues, that they need to take a prudent stance based on their own principles. Now, every major corporate has or claims, their own pillars of principle around the sustainability issue, around the human rights issue. They've got their own PR issues that they need to worry about when they go to market. And I think, we're going to see a lot more corporate activism as, we've seen it in the context of Russia. We saw it in the context of Qatar, actually, but, there is clearly a case now for accepting a world in which the corporates take a much more activist stance, pushed into that activist stance by their consumers and by their participants and stakeholders.
No, it's super interesting. Thank you, Nick, for that. And before I sort of hand it over to the studio, first I want to mention there is in the comments field, Moira from the UK has actually put in the chat a link to sporthumanrights.org, a really helpful resource center that provides guidance and that considers these issues at depth, as she says. So that's a really helpful. Thank you, Moira, for sharing that with this community. And before I send the ball back to the studio, Alison, corporate activism. I think that is sort of a key theme of yours. And Nick, I thought it was brilliant how you brought out actually apartheid in South Africa and how organizations, global businesses, the sports community came together and had a real impact. Alison, do you think that can happen? Do we have this will within the corporate world to actually have a true impact in this kind of way? What are your reflections?
I mean, it's a really, really interesting topic, and it has been really front and center in the US, I think to a much lesser extent so far in Europe, but starting at the beginning of the Trump administration and really ramping up to a high point in around 2018, maybe a high point in 2020 with George Floyd's murder. We have seen a vastly increased willingness of corporate leaders to speak up on controversial issues. So we have seen tech leaders talking about immigration and DACA. We've seen obviously lots of quotes and comments on problems with systemic racism. We've seen corporations taking stands on gun control. We've seen corporations really struggling with the dilemma over here of abortion and reproductive rights. So over the past decade, I think between around 2014 and 2021 was a real change. We had the first Black Lives Matter protest here in 2014 that corporations did not go anywhere near. Nobody would say a word. By 2021, it seems like every CEO in America is commenting on the George Floyd murder verdict. So we've seen a dramatic shift away from political neutrality and to this speaking up on issues, which, as you point out, it's very often young progressive employees and consumers pushing corporations into these stances. So I think this seemed somewhat unstoppable, but I think it's raised some real concerns. I think it has had the impact of highlighting hypocrisy. So it has evolved the conversation to this company is speaking up on climate change or speaking up on women's rights. Let's look at what they're doing behind the scenes on political spending. Let's look at their own policies. Let's look at who they're working with. Let's look at whether they really mean this. So that is where this kind of conversation's gone. We now have more recently also seen quite a lot of backlash from conservatives saying this is corporations getting out of their lane. They should stick to, doing business and not be speaking up on every single thing. While I have reservations about those arguments because I think those same politicians are quite keen to keep the money flowing behind the scenes, I think there are very strong arguments for corporations to focus on the material issues that they can actually impact. I think there are very strong imperatives, which partly explains maybe some of these moves on human rights, that you have an obligation and responsibility to your own employees and your own supply chain workers first, and that you need to protect them. So you would not, for example, send an LGBTQ employee to live in Qatar. So that would not be kind of acceptable. So I think corporations really, really wrestling with these dilemmas. And then I think in the past few years, and particularly the last 6 months, I'm seeing and hearing a lot of CEOs and C-suites acknowledging this, dialing back, saying maybe we don't need to speak up on every single thing that happens, that we need to be much more restrained, much more thoughtful, not overpromise, not exaggerate the impact that our business can have. And again, we have these ideas, right, of stakeholder capitalism and doing what stakeholders say and listening and responding to employees. But I think it's really important to remember a private corporation is not set up to democratically represent the will of its employees. We have political structures for that. I think we need to start asking questions about what corporations are doing when they intervene in political questions in that way. I would like to see more rigor around corruption and lobbying and campaign finance, and a little bit less speaking up on fashionable ESG issues. So I'm hearing here a bit of a shift. I'm hoping that we will have a little bit more sober, cautious action. I think, the big problem with these stakeholder capitalism ideas is that there's no conceptual limit on how far a corporation should go. So we have sort of Milton Friedman, all a corporation should do is make a profit. Then we have these stakeholder ideas, which can translate into, if any of your stakeholders care about this issue, you need to be taking action on it. And I think we're discovering that that is impractical. It raises concerns of hypocrisy. It is overreach. A lot of people do not agree with these roles of corporations. And so, again, I hope we're at the start of a conversation about the role of business in society and how that needs to evolve that's more realistic. But I think corporations at the moment in the US feel very trapped between Scylla and Charybdis. They feel trapped between a push for them to go further. And then now there is this kind of backlash. So perhaps there will be a good outcome, which is a better discussion. But a lot of the coverage and discourse I see in the public domain is not about these topics, and I think could be more constructive.
Yeah, wow. So the discussion definitely needs to continue. So I will send it over to the studio with the last poll. So how should then companies take a stand? And now we're asking more in the context of, sports. So please go and respond to that question. And with that, Nina, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for the very, very insightful conversations. And Andre, do you have any lobbying to do with the last question that we have, that how should companies take a stand?
So yeah, and how companies should take a stand on these issues. I believe that it's quite clear that, and talking to perhaps Alison's point of stakeholder capitalism, I think that we need to find the right balance of what is a healthy sponsorship relationship, what is and also from a governmental point of view is a similar thing. Most money, at least in Europe, going to sports organizations come from governments who also have an ethical contract with each one of these federations, where federations, sport associations, clubs need to fulfill certain ethical criteria on what they're doing to fight discrimination, what they're doing to avoid problems with their constituents that then have an impact on ultimately how much support and money they will get from government funding or from sponsorship on the private side. So it's a big issue on how do we ensure and support sports organizations, federations, clubs, and teams to have this self-policing and also ethical structures in place, regulations in place to have them come to a governance bar that is higher. This is something that I worked on a lot as a researcher when I was at the university, and my second book was on sports governance for Europe, and the bar was very low. The bar was very low in terms of internal systems to monitor on issues relating to doping, discrimination, and other issues, even safety of stadia, for example. There were a whole bunch of issues that were not in good shape that now actually with regulation have become a lot better. And self-regulation and also, of course, state regulation. But I think that for corporates, it's very important to have a very transparent relationship with the companies they are sponsoring, and also that they are doing business with even casually. As Anna mentioned, we're taking our customers to these sports events, and it's good to do your own due diligence in terms of, okay, how have they been treating their employees? How have they been conducting themselves in terms of financial, good governance and so on, and then from there, not engage if you feel that the sports organization in question is not, up to the standards, ethical standards that you believe are the minimum standards they need to attain to deserve that kind of financial support, sponsorship support, other types of value in kind support, or even state support.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes left from our airtime. So maybe as a last quick question for all of the panelists. So how do you see the future for sports and ethics?
In one sentence, a short sentence.
In one sentence, yeah.
I think the problem is not going to go away, and I'm hoping that this is going to be a real advance for applying business and human rights principles in business. We do have these frameworks that talk very clearly about the role of business, the role of government, and what corporations should be doing about these risks. And I would like to see those ideas applied more practically, and I hope they will be as a result of this conversation.
Nick.
I think we're as always, at the bottom of the hill. I think that the challenge is to treat what is clearly what you might call a performative level of change which has happened across the corporate world into reality. People stepping up to be as good as their words. I think that, recent events have shown that is and can happen. You just look at the of Hollywood, see how actually there is real change going on in Hollywood as a consequence of everything that's happened in the last few years there. And I think, Turkeys never vote for Christmas. So with this, it's all about public scrutiny, stakeholder participation, bringing about change through force of action. And ultimately, I think around more and more third-party monitoring, accepted international standards of behavior, and adjudicating people against those standards of behavior, getting information out there as to how people are actually performing, which they can be assessed against in a public forum. And I think once we start to achieve more and more of that, then the results will improve.
Thanks,
Brilliant. So let's keep the discussion going, Nina. That's I think our mission for this year with these other talks, and I think we should start to conclude here. We'll have the online events now are 45 minutes. So Nina, do you want to say a couple of final words from the studio?
Yes. By the way, I noticed that in the poll we had you were only able to choose one option, but obviously you could choose mentally all of them. But yes, thank you. Time flies as always, so it's been very insightful conversation. Thank you for all of our guests for your great insights, and see you in the next Ethics Talk Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheerio.